Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, as companies are starting to mandate employees return to the office on a full or part-time basis, they may be incurring costs and paying for accommodation for staff who need to travel overseas for work. My first guest, Stephen Dooley from Roamr, has developed a solution which enables companies to pay employees to host staff members instead of paying for hotel accommodation or Airbnbs. Stephen joins us now to tell us how this works and the savings which Roamr can generate for businesses. But Stephen, you completed a PhD in financial technology in UCC. What were the key areas of focus during the PhD?
Good morning. Thanks a million for having me, Karl. Yeah, so I spent an awful lot of time essentially trying to figure out how platforms that digitally disintermediate their industry, how do they create trust and adoption when a lot of the time they're breaking down long-standing barriers. So there was some of the companies I originally looked at in the financial space, like Revolut and some of the robo-advisor platforms, but actually kind of the second half of it was more focused on the likes of Uber and Airbnb and how do they create trust and adoption. So it was looking from a kind of socio-technical lens, what are the technical features that they built to do it in their products, what was the changing dynamics in the kind of social and consumer markets, and then what were the kind of environmental factors for them, and just wrapping it all in almost like a Venn diagram to try to understand the full suite of it.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So how do platforms such as Airbnb and Uber build trust and increase adoption amongst their target markets?
Yeah, well, look, we could dive very deep on that, but I suppose, there's certain pieces that have to happen from a technical perspective at the foundational level of the platform. It's all stuff that we're accustomed to and normal to now because we've experienced these platforms for, the bones of 10, 15 years at this stage. But at the time, things like rating and reviews on hosts weren't exactly standardized when those kind of companies were coming out, right? If you look at Uber versus the taxi market, there was no rating or review when you flag down a taxi, but you can pull up an Uber and you can see, exactly about the driver who's going to take you forward. At the same time on the Airbnb platform, they were going where they're changing the dynamic of an interaction from being a purely online thing, which we had up until about 2008. Now all of a sudden you're giving someone your live location, right, and bringing them to the real world. So there's an awful lot of work you have to do on the consumer psychology piece to overcome some of those hurdles. Often I quote to try to help people unlock what I was looking at. I tend to say that my parents gave me two lessons in life. Don't get in the car with a stranger and don't answer the door to a stranger. And yet Uber and Airbnb came along and really ripped the playbook up on that. So there's a lot wrapped up on how they did it.
And I know Roamr was established with the future of work in mind, but what do you think that the world of work may look like in the years ahead, especially in a world surrounded by AI?
It's a very interesting time now, plus the last 5 years. I think from our perspective, what we're noticing is that the way we work has totally changed insofar as the distribution of where people are. So companies are completely distributed now in the tech space. For example, 97% of tech companies have location flexibility. So what's different is people can be all over the place, but now we have this push-pull where it's great that we've given autonomy for people to choose where to work from and how we can be collaborating on a kind of online context. But we still need to put effort on culture and collaboration and bringing folks together. So what I've seen in the travel data is the way that we're traveling now is the spend is now being reapportioned significantly higher on bringing team members together. So spending budget, bringing team members to the HQ because maybe half the workforce are distributed and half the workforce are on site. So try to figure out how can we do that in a cost-effective manner is setting up. From an AI perspective, I think for us anyway, we're not specifically building AI tools, but how we've even seen it in how we work ourselves, the productivity levels are significantly higher. Like we have a very small team, but we've been quite punchy and quite fast. We can use it for coding. We can use it for workflows to get quicker. We can use it for data entry. It's kind of like having an intern alongside you all day long. So we've significantly improved our own output as a result of those changes.
So tell us about Roamr and the services that you provide.
Yeah, so look, we help companies save about 30% on corporate travel accommodation. And the way that we do it is we pay their employees instead of hotels. So I think the best way to conceptualize it is to use an example. So let's say you're a technology company. If you've got somebody in the Dublin office, for example, and you need them in San Francisco for a month-long project, that's going to cost the company $10,000 on hotel bills today. But what we're enabling is for that person to be hosted by a colleague or a friend that they know in that city and essentially redistribute the money between them. So instead of 10,000 going to a hotel and never to be seen again, you can have the host earning 3,000 The travelling employee also earns 3,000 because ultimately they chose Roamr over the hotel that would have been provided. And then the company saves about 30% on that trip as well. So it's kind of a win-win-win, right, where we're keeping the money inside the four walls of the company.
Well, if you've just tuned in, I'm speaking to Stephen Dooley, co-founder of Roamr. Stephen, is this platform aimed mainly at multinational companies that would have employees located in various different countries worldwide?
Yeah, well, look, to be honest, there's application across all the different organization sizes. Definitely, if there's a big tech company, they tend to have more people in their company, more locations that they operate in, and massive budgets moving people around between those locations. But what's interesting is companies that are in maybe a startup or an SMB scenario, they may experience the pain point and be able to survive if this was even an internal only tool. So, a company that has 4 hubs, you'll say, in London, Dublin, San Fran, and New York, and about 600 employees. So I have a specific example, but I won't share the name of it. But 53% of their team are remote, and they're spending 90% of their budget now bringing those team members together to those different office hubs to build that culture and collaboration, which is great for us because they actually already have the supply in those cities where they've got maybe 100 people living within commutable distance to that San Francisco office. So there's an opportunity to tap into that straight away if it wasn't a large company. And the other side as well is we have a product coming soon where you're able to tap into the personal networks of those folks. So for me, when I travel to London, I stay with my girlfriend's father who lives on the last tube stop as far out of the city as possible because we're frugal startup founders trying to save money. But if I work for a company who is paying for that hotel, I'll be staying in the city centre. But it's the same experience where we could take that money and redistribute it into the personal network to the employees as well.
From your experience with the companies you're working with currently, what percentage of their staff are open to hosting their colleagues?
Yeah, so look, it varies depending on the culture. It varies depending on how much championing we get internally from some of the buy-in. But, the average is probably between 30% and 60% is the high point that we've seen. So, we can talk about various surveys that are going when 60% of the employees said that they'd be interested in hosting and about 56% that they'd be interested in staying. And it's just dependent on probably the culture internally and how well the employees get behind the idea and the concept.
And who determines the rate which the hosting employee receives for providing the accommodation?
Yeah, so look, we would work with companies on that. Some of them actually already have rates established in major cities, so they might have frequent travel destinations, and they've managed to have partnerships with hotels and discounts in those areas. So for us, it's very simple. If that's the case, we just transplant the rates that they already have. Maybe they have a Nike budget, and the other side is kind of market pricing. So there'd be platforms out there in the corporate travel space like Navan and Travel Perk, and the older players are SAP Concur, and ultimately a lot of the corporates use these platforms already. So you can kind of see what the price to beat would be on that given date. So basically, we set the rate based on the alternative hotel that would have been used if Roamr wasn't a thing.
Is insurance a consideration for these hosting employees, bringing somebody into their own residence, somebody that's ultimately paying to stay there? Does that employee need specific commercial insurance in place?
Yeah, well, we've already integrated a damage cover protection. So it depends obviously on the company. Typically they have travel insurance anyway for their employees when they're traveling for work. But the layer that's more unique about Roamr is that protection of the home and the protection of the guests within that home. So we've already integrated with a provider for that. And thankfully, it's a bespoke product that covers both sides of that interaction. So the host, in the event of, God forbid, someone would fall and have personal injury claim, or the guest in the event of accidental damage that might occur in that home. So yeah, look, a massively important consideration. A huge part of the PhD research was how those companies build trust and safety, and it's absolutely laser focused for us.
I know one of the routes to market, Stephen, that Roamr is using is a partnership model, and you've already established that with 3 companies, Deal, Remote and Oyster. Talk to us about how that works.
Yeah, to be honest, we're massively proud about getting those partnerships put together. We're still a young company, but those are really established companies. They're all worth over $1 billion. But what's really interesting about their business model is they're what's called an employer of record. So if you wanted to hire somebody in a different country that you don't have an entity in, or maybe you don't have the local knowledge on payroll and compliance, you can use one of these platforms to hire somebody through that platform ultimately. And Deal, for example, have 25,000 clients around the world. So they're the fastest growing startup in history. They went from $1 million ARR to 100 million ARR in a single year. And for us, it's a super alignment because by virtue of being one of the clients of Deal, Remote, and Oyster, you are a distributed company already. That's why you're using that service. So it's a super distribution channel for us. Some of the relationships are early stages there as well, and we're trying to get them up and running. But we had a really enjoyable side event happen in Dublin with Deal, which is nice, and it elevates us into a place from a brand recognition perspective as well too, when we're being championed as a disruptor in the travel space, and someone who's hopefully contributing to where the future of work is headed.
And of course, Roamr recently secured €500,000 in funding following the completion of an oversubscribed round. Talk to us about the investors which have now backed the business.
Yeah, again, massively proud, and as we kind of look at the board right there, we're still pinching ourselves to see how we've surrounded ourselves with folks like, in the Irish scene, the likes of John Reardon, who'd be the chairman of Shopify International, and a really well-respected thought leader whose nickname is the Godfather of Remote Work, who sits on the board of Quintus Capital as well. Most recently, John is massively connected. Owen Quigley would be former head of global mobility at KPMG and prolific angel investor in the Irish scene and sits on the board of Elkstone. Rick Kelly is the managing director of Meta, a former managing director of Meta, so really understands the big tech scene. But we've a bunch of investors in the States that we kind of established advice-based relationships with first. So we kind of looked at the company and said, what do we need to unlock our understanding of, and it was a lot of it was the buyer journey in big tech and media tech. So we brought in some chief people officers who are at the top table in companies like former chief people officer of Atlassian and Calendly, someone who's quite senior in the likes of Cisco, having held director positions in Google, Netflix, and Workday. And yeah, we're kind of pinching ourselves, I still think, of being able to surround ourselves with those kind of folks, but they're massive unlocks. They fully understand the space that we're in.
And Stephen, in terms of future growth plans for Roamr, where do the opportunities exist and how do you plan to maximise them outside of the partnership model?
Yeah, well, look, there's opportunity everywhere because it's such a big pain point. Like, travel is a $1.3 trillion market, and the amount that's being spent on accommodation as a total of the budget has increased to 36% from 34%. So for us, we see opportunity right across the world. We've got users now in 96 countries on the platform. The US is definitely a focus for us over the next 12 months. So a lot of large tech and a lot of decision makers for distributed companies tend to base themselves there. But there's opportunity essentially right across the world for us.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Stephen Dooley from Roamr, and I hope that the recent investment will accelerate the business's growth internationally.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.